The sound reached him first, not the explosion, the silence. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann stood in the technical observation bunker at Peenemünde, stopwatch in hand, counting seconds between engine cutoff and impact. 7 seconds of silence. 7 seconds during which 30,000 people below would hear death approaching and be unable to do anything but wait. He had helped design the timer mechanism. He had calibrated it himself. And now, watching the plume of smoke rise from the test range, he understood something that made his engineering degree feel like a certificate of damnation. They had built a weapon so indiscriminate, so primitive in its cruelty that even its creators feared it. This is the story of the V-1 flying bomb, Germany's Vergeltungswaffe 1, the vengeance weapon. But it is really about what happens when engineers are commanded to abandon precision for terror, when technical brilliance is harnessed not to win battles, but to break civilian morale, and what it reveals about the gap between what weapons are designed to do and what they actually accomplish, between military necessity and systematic cruelty, between innovation and atrocity. June 1944. The Wehrmacht was in retreat on all fronts. Allied armies had landed at Normandy. Soviet forces were crushing Army Group Center. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over the Reich itself. In this context of cascading failure, Hitler demanded miracles, not tactical victories, not strategic brilliance, miracles. Weapons that would terrorize the Allies into surrender through sheer psychological horror. The V-1 was Germany's answer, a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives, a cruise missile before the term existed, a flying bomb that would strike London with such frequency and randomness that the British would lose the will to fight. That was the theory. The reality, as Hartmann and thousands of other German engineers would discover, was far more complex and far more disturbing. To understand why the V-1 terrorized its own creators, you need to understand what it was, not just technically, but philosophically. The V-1 represented a fundamental shift in German weapons philosophy. For years, the Reich had prided itself on precision. The Stuka dive bomber could place bombs within meters of a target. German artillery calculations were legendary for their accuracy. Panzer doctrine emphasized surgical strikes against specific objectives. Precision was not just tactical, it was ideological. It proved German technical superiority, German discipline, German excellence. The V-1 abandoned all of that. It was designed from the first blueprint to be inaccurate, not accidentally, intentionally. Its targeting system was primitive by design, its navigation crude, its impact point essentially random within a radius of several kilometers. This was not a weapon aimed at military targets. This was a weapon aimed at cities, at populations, at the concept of safety itself. The technical specifications tell. Part of the story. Length, 7.9 meters. Wingspan, 5.3 meters. Weight at launch, 2,150 kilograms. Warhead, 850 kilograms of amytal explosive. Power plant, 1 Argus pulse jet engine producing 2.8 kilonewtons of thrust. Maximum speed, 640 kilometers per hour. Range, 250 kilometers. Cost, approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks, roughly 1/50th the cost of a fighter aircraft. These numbers excited the Reich Ministry of Armaments. 5,000 Reichsmarks per bomb. No pilot required, therefore no training costs, no losses of experienced aircrew. Production could be distributed across dozens of factories, making the manufacturing process resilient to Allied bombing. Launch sites were simple, just a ramp and some basic infrastructure, easily concealed and rapidly relocated. On paper, the V-1 was a procurement officer's dream, a cheap, mass-producible terror weapon that required minimal resources and could be deployed faster than the Allies could destroy launch sites. But those same numbers horrified the engineers who had to actually make the system work. Hartmann's diary entries from early 1943, when development began in earnest, reveal a man watching his profession being corrupted. February 18, 1943. Ordered to simplify guidance system. When I objected that this would reduce accuracy to unacceptable levels, I was told that accuracy is not the objective. The objective is frequency of impact and psychological effect. I do not know how to reconcile this with my training. March 7, 1943. Tested timer cutoff mechanism today. Functions perfectly. Shuts down engine after preset flight time. The bomb then glides briefly before diving to Earth. Friedman pointed out that this creates a warning period, that people on the ground will hear the engine stop and know they have seconds to take cover. We were told this is intentional. The silence is part of the psychological weapon. I spent 6 years studying engineering to create 7 seconds of silence before death. The pulse jet engine itself was brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. Developed by Robert Lusser and Fritz Goslau, the Argus AS 109-014 was elegantly simple. Air entered the front intake, was mixed with fuel and ignited, creating a pressure wave that closed spring-loaded shutters at the intake. The explosion forced exhaust out the rear, creating thrust. The shutters then reopened due to the pressure drop, allowing new air to enter, and the cycle repeated, 50 times per second. This produced the characteristic buzzing roar that gave the V-1 its nickname in England, the buzz bomb or doodlebug. The engine had no moving parts except the shutters. It could be manufactured by semi-skilled labor with minimal materials. It could run on low-grade fuel. It was, from a production standpoint, a masterpiece of cost-effective design. It was also unbelievably loud, not just loud, psychologically oppressive. Luftwaffe test pilots who flew chase missions alongside V-1s during trials reported that the pulse jet's oscillating roar at 50 pulses per second induced nausea and disorientation even at several hundred meters distance. Ground crews at launch sites suffered hearing damage even with protection. The sound was designed into the weapon, part of its psychological impact. But it became immediately clear that this psychological weapon was affecting its creators as much as its intended targets. Security personnel at Peenemünde reported difficulty sleeping, constant headaches, ringing in the ears that persisted for days after launch operations. The weapon was terrorizing its own support staff before it ever reached England. The guidance system, such as it was, consisted of 3 components, each one a study in deliberate imprecision. First, a compass to maintain heading, magnetic, prone to deviation, affected by metal structures and electromagnetic interference. Second, an anemometer-driven air screw on the nose to measure distance traveled. It counted revolutions, and after a preset number, triggered the dive mechanism. Wind speed affected its accuracy. Varying air density affected its accuracy. Any damage during launch affected its accuracy. Third, a pair of gyroscopes to maintain attitude and prevent the bomb from rolling or pitching excessively. These were the only sophisticated components in the entire system, and even they were simplified versions of aircraft instruments. This was the entire navigation system for a weapon expected to hit London from launch sites in France. No radio guidance, which could be jammed. No visual guidance, which would have required a human operator. No terminal guidance, which would have added complexity and cost. Just a compass, a windmill, and 2 gyroscopes sending a bomb toward a city. Engineers testing the system understood immediately what this meant. During trials in 1943, test launches aimed at Baltic Sea targets showed circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of weapons would impact, of approximately 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers. A V-1 aimed at Tower Bridge might hit anywhere within a circle stretching from Westminster to Canary Wharf, from Camden to Peckham. This was not a precision weapon experiencing technical difficulties. This was a weapon whose imprecision was baked into its fundamental design, and every engineer working on the program knew it. On June 13, 1944, at 04:18, the first operational V-1 flying bomb launched from a site near Calais. 3 more followed at intervals through the night. Of the 4, one crashed immediately after launch, its engine failing before it cleared the French coast. One went off course and impacted in the English Channel. One struck a railway bridge in Gravesend, killing 6 people. One landed in Bethnal Green in East London, destroying a row of houses and killing 8 civilians, including 4 children. The campaign had begun. Over the next 2 weeks, launch crews would fire over 2,000 V-1s at London. Roughly 1/4 crashed on launch or shortly thereafter due to mechanical failure. Another quarter went wildly off course or fell into the sea. Of those that reached England, many were shot down by anti-aircraft fire or intercepted by RAF fighters. But hundreds got through, and they killed without pattern, without warning, without any relationship between their impact points and anything of military value. In London, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Blitz of 1940 and 1941 had been terrible, but it followed patterns. Bombers came at night. Air raid sirens provided warning. There were shelters, procedures, a sense that if you followed the rules, you increased your chances of survival. The V-1 offered none of that. They came at all hours, day and night. They could strike anywhere. The engine noise provided warning only in the final seconds, and that warning was itself a form of torture. Londoners learned to stop conversations mid-sentence when they heard the buzz, counting seconds, waiting to see if the engine would cut out overhead or pass by. If it cut out, you had perhaps 7 seconds. Dive into the nearest shelter, hit the ground, pull your children close, or simply stand frozen, knowing that in this lottery of explosive death, there was nothing skill or caution could do to save you. But back in Germany, in the engineering offices and production facilities and launch site command bunkers, a different kind of terror was taking hold. The terror of understanding what you have created. Hartmann's diary from July 1944 documents this psychological unraveling. July 3rd. Received impact reports from today's launches. 17 V-1s reached London area. Civilian casualties estimated at over 100. Military targets hit, none. Transport infrastructure damaged, minor. I asked Colonel Wachtel what we were accomplishing. He said we were accomplishing exactly what was intended, breaking British morale. I asked how we measure morale. He did not answer. July 15th. Spoke with Dornberger today about guidance accuracy. He dismissed my concerns, said Hitler personally approved the targeting philosophy. The objective is maximum psychological impact per Reichsmark invested, maximum terror per ton of explosives. He used the word terror without hesitation, without shame. I realized then that we are not building weapons. We are building instruments of systematic frightfulness, and I am complicit. The production system itself began generating its own horror. Because the V-1 was designed to be cheap and mass-producible, component manufacturing was distributed across hundreds of facilities. Many used forced labor, concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, slave laborers from occupied territories. They assembled pulse jet components in underground factories. They worked until exhaustion or death, and then were replaced. Engineers touring these facilities saw the human cost of their cost-effective designs. Each simplified component, each reduction in manufacturing, complexity that made the V-1 cheaper to produce, meant more could be demanded from labor that cost the Reich nothing because it was stolen. The economics of the V-1 were the economics of slavery with a thin veneer of technical sophistication. Some engineers requested transfers. Others rationalized. Others still tried to sabotage their own designs, introducing subtle flaws that would increase failure rates, hoping to reduce the weapon's effectiveness without being detected as saboteurs. Hartmann was not alone in his crisis of conscience. Across the V-1 program, technical personnel found themselves trapped between professional duty and moral horror. They had been trained to solve problems. Now the problem they were solving was how to terrorize civilians more efficiently. Some broke psychologically. Alcoholism rates among V-1 technical staff were significantly higher than in conventional weapons programs. Suicide rates likewise. The weapon was destroying its creators from the inside. Launch crews experienced their own particular nightmare. A V-1 launch was simple in theory. Position the bomb on the ramp, fuel it, arm the warhead, ignite the engine. Once thrust reached sufficient level, release the catapult. The pulse jet would accelerate the bomb down the ramp and into the air. In practice, failures were common and lethal. Pulse jets occasionally exploded on ignition, immolating ground crews. Structural failures during catapult acceleration sent bombs cartwheeling into support facilities. Premature warhead detonations vaporized everyone within 50 meters. By August 1944, launch crews were suffering casualty rates comparable to frontline infantry. They were being killed by their own weapons at a higher rate than by Allied bombing or commando raids. The V-1 was eating its handlers. And then there was the problem of impact intelligence. To improve accuracy, the Reich needed to know where bombs were actually landing. This required reconnaissance, analysis of British damage reports, interrogation of agents. What they discovered was devastating. Not militarily, the weapon's military impact was always negligible, but psychologically devastating to the engineers who reviewed the data. August 12, 1944. Received detailed impact analysis from Abwehr. V-1 number 3847, launched August 4th at 14:32, impacted Stepney at 15:07. Direct hit on primary school. 61 children killed. Building collapsed during class hours. Rescue workers pulled bodies from rubble for 18 hours. The bomb's guidance system functioned perfectly. Its compass heading was correct within 2 degrees. Its range mechanism triggered within 400 meters of program distance. The weapon performed exactly as designed. And it murdered children at their desks. I cannot stop thinking about the timer mechanism I calibrated. I set the flight duration. I determined when the engine would cut off. My mathematics killed 61 children. The psychological weight of this knowledge manifested in different ways. Some engineers doubled down, embracing the mission as necessary to German survival, convincing themselves that British civilians were legitimate targets in total war. Others compartmentalized, focusing purely on technical problems while refusing to think about consequences. Others began to hope for failures, for Allied bombing raids that would disrupt production, for anything that would reduce the weapon's effectiveness. And a small number began actively working against the program, introducing flaws, miscalibrating instruments, providing intelligence to resistance groups about launch sites. These were not ideological resistors. These were engineers who could no longer live with what their expertise was producing. The Allies, meanwhile, were learning to counter the V-1. Initially, fighters struggled to intercept the fast-moving bombs. But tactics evolved. Tempest and Mosquito fighters could match the V-1's speed and had the engine power to catch them. Pilots learned to fly alongside and flip the V-1's wing with their own wingtip, disrupting its gyroscopes and sending it spiraling into the channel. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed to the coast in massive concentrations. Radar-directed fire brought down hundreds. Barrage balloons created aerial obstacles that snagged bombs before they reached central London. By late August, interception rates exceeded 50%. Of bombs that launched successfully, fewer than half were reaching London. And of those, many were being diverted by British intelligence feeding false damage reports back to German reconnaissance, causing launch crews to adjust aim in directions that actually worsened accuracy. The V-1 campaign was failing, not because the weapon did not work. It worked exactly as designed, but because what it was designed to do, break British morale through random terror, was not achievable. Londoners adapted, Shelters were strengthened, warning systems improved, people learned to live with the buzz bombs the way they had learned to live with the Blitz. The terror became normalized. And all the while, German resources that could have produced fighters to defend the Reich, or tanks to hold the Eastern Front, or fuel to move armies, were instead producing flying bombs that killed randomly and accomplished nothing of military value. By September 1944, Allied armies overrunning France were capturing launch sites faster than the Luftwaffe could redeploy them. The campaign that was supposed to terrorize Britain into surrender had lasted less than 3 months and achieved nothing except the deaths of approximately 6,000 British civilians and the psychological destruction of the Germans who created the weapon. Hartmann's final diary entry from the V-1 program is dated September 9, 1944. Last launch from this site today. Evacuation orders received. Allied armor approaching. We are to destroy equipment and withdraw. I watched the final V-1 climb into the sky, engine buzzing, headed toward London. I knew that in 25 minutes it would kill someone. I knew I had helped make that death possible. I knew that nothing I could do now would stop it. This is what we have accomplished. We have built 10,000 flying bombs. We have killed thousands of civilians. We have terrorized a population that refused to break. We have diverted resources from weapons that might have changed the war's outcome. We have employed slave labor on a massive scale. We have corrupted engineering into an instrument of indiscriminate murder. And we have destroyed ourselves in the process. I can no longer sleep without seeing fire. I can no longer hear high-pitched sounds without flinching. I can no longer look at technical drawings without imagining what they will be used to kill. We set out to create a vengeance weapon. We succeeded in creating a weapon that took its vengeance on everyone, including us. The final accounting of the V-1 campaign reveals the full scope of its failure and the depth of its psychological cost. Total V-1s produced, approximately 30,000. Total launched operationally, approximately 22,000. Of those, roughly 1/3 failed mechanically before reaching England. Another third were destroyed by air defenses or crashed due to navigation failure. Of the roughly 7,000 that impacted British territory, military targets struck, effectively 0. The V-1 destroyed some houses, some shops, some schools, and hospitals and churches. It killed approximately 6,000 civilians. It injured another 18,000. It accomplished nothing of strategic value. It did not slow Allied advance. It did not reduce British war production. It did not break morale. It did not change the outcome of a single battle. What it did do was reveal something profound and terrible about the nature of technological warfare when divorced from ethical constraints. The V-1 was possible because German engineering was excellent. The guidance systems, while crude by modern standards, were sophisticated for their time. The pulse jet engine was genuinely innovative. The manufacturing processes were efficient. The launch systems were effective. Every component worked. The engineers who designed these systems were not incompetent. They were highly trained professionals at the top of their fields, and their expertise was harnessed to create a weapon whose only possible use was the indiscriminate killing of civilians. This was not a failure of technology. This was a success of technology applied to an immoral purpose. In the immediate aftermath, as Germany collapsed and Allied forces occupied former V-1 production and launch facilities, investigators interviewed hundreds of technical personnel. The psychological damage was pervasive. Many engineers exhibited what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, overwhelming guilt, inability to engage with technical work. Some had already taken their own lives. Others would do so in the years following the war. The V-1 program left a trail of psychological casualties among its creators that rivaled its physical casualties among its targets. The interrogations revealed a consistent pattern, engineers describing how they rationalized their work, how they told themselves they were just solving technical problems, how they compartmentalized their expertise from the consequences of that expertise, how they believed or forced themselves to believe that they were serving a greater purpose, defending the fatherland, following orders, doing their duty. And then, gradually or suddenly, how that rationalization collapsed, how they could no longer avoid seeing what they were actually doing, how the gap between their professional identity and the moral reality of their work became unbearable. One engineer, whose name appears in Allied interrogation reports only as Subject 17, described the moment his certainty shattered. He had been working on improving the V-1's fuel efficiency, trying to extend its range so launch sites could be positioned further from Allied fighters. He was good at his job. His modifications added 30 kilometers to the weapon's range. He was proud of this achievement. Then he saw an intelligence report estimating that his modifications had allowed an additional 400 V-1s to reach London that would otherwise have fallen short. The report estimated this resulted in approximately 200 additional civilian deaths, 200 people. Dead because he had solved a fuel efficiency problem. He described sitting in his office, staring at this report, and understanding for the first time that technical excellence and moral horror were not contradictory. His expertise had not been corrupted by the Nazi regime. His expertise had been used exactly as intended, and the intended purpose was atrocity. He said he could no longer look at an engineering diagram without seeing a body count. This is the part of the story where we need to understand something about the psychology of expertise under authoritarianism. When you are trained to solve problems, when your identity is built around technical competence, when you are rewarded for innovation and punished for failure, it becomes dangerously easy to focus on the problem in front of you and ignore the context around it. The V-1 engineers were not monsters. They were normal people, well-educated, many from middle-class backgrounds, trained in respected universities who had entered their professions with the same aspirations as engineers anywhere. They wanted to build things. They wanted to solve challenging problems. They wanted to demonstrate mastery of their craft. The Nazi state took these normal professional aspirations and channeled them towards systematic terror, and the engineers, by focusing on the technical challenges and ignoring the moral ones, became complicit in that terror. But here is what makes the V-1 story particularly disturbing. It was not just the engineers who were terrorized by what they created. The entire system of production, deployment, and evaluation was permeated with a creeping dread that eventually infected everyone involved. Launch crew commanders who filed daily reports knowing they were documenting random murder. Intelligence analysts who calculated civilian casualty rates and tried to frame them as success metrics. Logistics officers who coordinated fuel deliveries and knew that each liter of fuel translated to another few hundred meters of flight distance, another few houses destroyed, another few families killed. Factory managers who pushed production quotas using slave labor and knew the slaves were dying to build weapons that killed indiscriminately. Military leadership that received enthusiastic reports about psychological impact and knew those reports were describing organized frightfulness. The V-1 program created a system where everyone involved understood at some level that they were participating in something that violated basic human decency. And because the system was authoritarian, because questioning orders could result in imprisonment or death, because the machinery of production had its own momentum, people continued. They continued building. They continued launching. They continued killing. And they continued being destroyed internally by the knowledge of what they were doing. This was not ignorance. This was knowledge combined with powerlessness, or perceived powerlessness, or cultivated powerlessness, or the powerlessness that comes from prioritizing personal safety over moral responsibility. After the war, V-1 technology became the foundation for cruise missile development by both the United States and Soviet Union. The technical innovations, the pulse jet engine design, the guidance principles, the launch systems, All were studied, improved, and incorporated into weapons that would define Cold War arsenals. The engineers who survived were recruited by Allied powers. Many went on to distinguished careers. The moral complexities of their V-1 work were generally set aside in the interest of acquiring their expertise. This itself reveals something uncomfortable. The same technical knowledge that had been used for indiscriminate terror bombing was considered valuable enough that the moral questions surrounding it could be overlooked. Expertise, it turns out, is transferable and morally neutral. What matters is the purpose to which it is applied, and powers that condemned the V-1 as a terror weapon were perfectly willing to employ its designers to build their own terror weapons. Hartmann survived the war. His personnel file shows he was not a Nazi Party member, though this was unusual for someone at his level in a weapons program. He was briefly detained by British forces, interrogated about V-1 technical details, and released. He returned to civilian engineering, working on automotive design. He never spoke publicly about his V-1 work. His diaries were discovered after his death in 1987, donated to a historical archive by his daughter, who said her father had nightmares until the end of his life. Nightmares in which he heard the pulse jet sound, that buzzing roar, followed by silence, followed by an explosion, over and over. For 43 years after the last V-1 he helped design fell on London, he was still being terrorized by the sound of his own creation. This is what the V-1 story ultimately reveals. Terror weapons terrorize everyone. They terrorize their targets, obviously. That is their designed purpose. But they also terrorize their creators in ways that are less obvious and more insidious. They force technical professionals to confront the gap between their expertise and its consequences. They create systems where everyone involved knows they are participating in something immoral, but feels powerless to stop it. They generate psychological trauma that persists long after the weapons themselves are silenced. The V-1 did not just buzz over London, it buzzed through the psyches of everyone who built it, launched it, and tried to live with what they had done. We tell ourselves that technology is neutral, that tools can be used for good or evil depending on the user's intent. The V-1 story suggests this is a comfortable lie. Some technologies are designed specifically for purposes that guarantee their use will be immoral. A weapon built to be inaccurate, built to strike randomly, built to maximize civilian casualties per unit cost, is not neutral. It is immoral by design. And the engineers who build such weapons, no matter how technically brilliant their work, cannot escape moral responsibility by claiming they were just solving problems. They were solving the problem of how to terrorize more efficiently, and that problem should never have been solved. In 1944, as the first V-1s were falling on London, the British press coined terms to describe them: buzz bomb, doodlebug, robot plane. These names tried to make the weapons comprehensible, to domesticate the terror. But the name that should haunt us, the name that captures what they actually were, is the one the Germans themselves chose: Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. Not a weapon of military necessity, not a weapon of strategic importance, a weapon of vengeance. A weapon built to inflict pain because pain itself was the objective. And when you build a weapon whose purpose is vengeance, when you design systems to maximize suffering, when you harness technical excellence to serve systematic cruelty, you do not just terrorize your enemies, you terrorize yourself. You become trapped in a system where your expertise is a curse, where your competence is complicity, where your professional pride is tied to the body count your designs produce. The V-1 flying bomb killed 6,000 British civilians, but it also killed something in the people who created it. It killed their certainty that technical work is inherently noble. It killed their ability to separate means from ends. It killed the comfortable fiction that engineers are not responsible for how their designs are used. Every engineer who worked on the V-1 and survived to reflect on that work had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had the expertise, they had the knowledge, they had the ability to refuse, to resist, to sabotage, to at minimum not contribute their talent to a weapon of systematic terror. And most of them did not refuse. They rationalized, they compartmentalized, they told themselves they were just doing their jobs, and then they had to live with the consequences of that choice. This is the lesson the V-1 offers across the decades. Technical expertise without moral courage is not neutral. It is dangerous. It can be harnessed to any purpose, including the worst purposes humans can conceive. And when you allow your expertise to be used for immoral ends, even under pressure, even under orders, even in fear for your own safety, you pay a price. The price is not just legal or professional. It is psychological. It is the loss of the ability to see your work as separate from its consequences. It is the permanent knowledge that your competence contributed to suffering, that your problem-solving skills were applied to the problem of how to kill more efficiently, how to terrorize more systematically, how to cause pain at scale. The last V-1 fell on Britain on March 29, 1945, nearly 9 months after the first. The campaign had accomplished nothing of military value and had cost Germany resources it desperately needed for conventional defense. In the final accounting, the V-1 stands as one of the clearest examples in modern warfare of a weapon that failed strategically, succeeded only in causing random suffering, and destroyed the people who created it almost as thoroughly as it destroyed its intended targets. The buzz of the pulse jet engine, that distinctive 50 cycle per second roar, was heard by Londoners as the sound of approaching death. But it was also heard, in memory and nightmare, by German engineers as the sound of their own moral collapse, the sound of expertise divorced from ethics, the sound of technical brilliance serving systematic evil. And that sound, unlike the weapon itself, never stopped. It echoed in nightmares for decades. It echoes still in the historical record, a reminder that what we build has consequences we cannot escape, and that terror weapons, in the end, terrorize everyone.